Once upon a time, there was an ambitious and conceited college undergraduate named Matt. Every day, he honed his skills as a writer and prepared himself for a career in law or politics. One day, he sat at his aunt's bedside and watched her die. Because of that, the work he had been doing began to feel meaningless. Because of that, he let go of his previous aspirations and took a job at his parents' deli. He worked there for a couple of years after graduation and spent a lot of time discerning his vocation, until finally he entered graduate school to study philosophy. And ever since that day, he has not stopped seeking to live a more meaningful life.
Welcome to A Life Worth Working, a podcast about how we get to the soul of work. We're your hosts, Dana Allen Walsh and Michelle Weiss. I'm the senior pastor of a progressive church, and Michelle's a writer on the future of education and work.
And as always, we love hearing your comments, questions, and thoughts. So please know you can email us at any time at hello@alifeworthworking.com.
And make sure you subscribe to our show and share it with your friends and loved ones who may be searching for more meaning in their work lives.
In this episode, we chat with Matthew Clemente, the Director of Research and Curriculum at the Center for Psychological Humanities and Ethics at Boston College. Matthew also teaches in a prison education program for BC at a men's institution in Shirley, Massachusetts. He also has a great column that he co-authors on Psychology Today called Our Human Condition. Matthew, I know when we first met, we were in a tiny pub where the ceiling was like maybe just a few inches above us. And we were bonding over the fact that I think you study a fair amount about death.
That's true.
And Dana and I had actually just finished recording with a death doula, and I was telling you about how joyful and buoyant she was because she lived so proximate to death all the time, right? And so she saw like how life-giving that force could be also in her everyday life.
You could only say we bonded in a pub over death when speaking to a philosopher, probably. And that's not something you're going to say to most people. I had said that kind of the first catalyst for me to change the direction of my life was the death of my aunt. And one of the things that really I grappled with in the months and maybe even years after her death was this question of when you have experienced death closely in your life, when it's touched you closely, I think that you can have this reflection of, oh, this is what happens. My aunt's death was not what I expected someone dying to be like. In a way, she was surrounded by family. She had lived a good, long life. I was told, and the kind of cultural idea was always that, wouldn't it be nice to die in old age, surrounded by people who love you and kind of peacefully go? And so I had this kind of image in my mind that that's kind of what could happen. And then we were told by the doctors that it would, should pass relatively easily, and she didn't. It was actually a really terrible and trying experience. And we were at her bedside for a few days, kind of watching her suffer and die. I've been with multiple family members since that who have passed. And I'll say I've never been in a room where it felt like it was a kind of easy transition. It always felt painful and laboring and excruciating. And so what that's done for me is it's put into relief a lot of the ways in which I live my life. I say to myself often, knowing that I'm going to die and knowing that that's what will happen to all of us, am I living my life well? Am I doing things today that are valuable to me and are valuable to the people around me? And it's also made me really reflect on suffering quite a bit. How suffering is not something to be avoided, but something that's an inherent part of life and something that we're going to have to deal with. And so those types of reflections then have me often thinking about what's my responsibility in the midst of suffering? How do I shoulder it well? How do I live through suffering and not try to avoid it? Or how do I try and help others live through their suffering, knowing that it can be excruciating? This has like really important, very small, practical results for me. So one is like, I do a lot of academic work, and some of it can be really just tedious editorial work or things like that. That anyone who's an academic will tell you it's not really glamorous, and it can be very painful. And I'll be sitting doing it, and I'll have a deadline coming up, and I'll know that the editor wants this work in soon, and I'll hear my kids playing in the backyard, and I'll say to myself, well, I'm going to die. So, so I might as well put this on pause and go play with my kids. I'll get back to it later. And sometimes that means that I'm not the most timely employee, that I'm not as on top of my work as I should be. But it also means that I've had the ability to be really invested in my kids' lives in ways that's been really significant for me. And I hope someday they'll look back and think it was meaningful for them. It also means that, the question of suffering means that when you love people and care about people and have a lot of people in your life, which I do, beyond my family, I have a ton of students, I have a ton of people who I'm interacting with. It means that there's kind of a responsibility to recognize when other people are suffering and do what you can to show up, And I don't know how the people around me would think about it. I think that I try hard to show up when I can and in ways that I can. And that's definitely something that I've wanted to deliberately grow in since I was in college and kind of felt this need to really change my life in certain ways.
That's so powerful, your willingness to look suffering in the face and to be willing to encounter it and to encounter it in other people's lives. And I'm wondering about that connection to prison education that you've been doing. Does that feed into your willingness to walk into a prison and encounter the suffering there and to do that work of teaching in that space?
The prison education work has been just some of the most meaningful work I've done in my career. I think what has been really great about it is realizing that in the midst of very trying situations, which a lot of the guys I work with obviously have come from situations that are absolutely terrible, and I hear their stories, there's a lot of joy that can be found. And so, one of the things I admire most about the guys I work with and I like most is that they all have really good senses of humor. And I grew up with a mother who was just incredibly funny, especially in the midst of pain. I mean, we're kind of always joking morbidly about painful things, which is not everyone's cup of tea, I found. So a lot of people don't get it when I'm making kind of morbid jokes. But Black humor has been very important to me. And in the midst of suffering in my own life, it's been something that's been almost salvific for me, the ability to laugh at difficult things. And so entering into that world, one of the things that has been really refreshing for me and eye-opening for me is just how much humor these guys bring to what they do. They're very serious about their work. They're some of the best students I've ever had. They do all of the reading. They show up ready to talk. They have a wealth of experience in their lives that they can draw from. And they see the value of education in ways that very few of my undergraduates do. A lot of them will talk about how if they had had the opportunity to have a good education earlier, they feel like their life would have been on a very different track. So they really see the significance of it. All of that's hugely rewarding. But the most rewarding thing about it for me is that these guys know how to laugh in painful situations. I mean, they'll joke with me. This sounds, I don't know how it's going to sound, but they'll joke with me. I'll say to them, like, they'll make a, kind of a snarky comment. I'll say, don't forget that I grade you. And then, one of them will say, well, you're in this room alone with us right now. So, you don't forget that. And we all can laugh. And the humor of it is that when you go into a prison, there is anxiety that goes along with it. There is, you're walking through all these checkpoints and you're being searched and you're going through metal detectors. And they get that. They get that there's an anxiety in the room, and we can kind of joke about that in a way. And so I think that experience has, for me, kind of underscored another aspect of something that's been hugely significant to me in dealing with suffering, which is that if you can laugh at something, it takes some of the sting out of it. And if you can do that, it can bring people together in the midst of very difficult things.
Oh, I love that. I often think of Stephen Colbert's quote, who, encountered a lot of suffering when his father and brothers died in a plane accident when he was young. But he said that you can't laugh and be afraid at the same time. And I've always thought that's so powerful, right?
Absolutely.
Can you explain to folks what you do right now?
Yeah, well, I feel like my life continues to change. It's one thing that my mother gives me a hard time about a lot. She says, "You've never kind of settled on doing one thing." So even though
Join the
I would
club.
call myself an academic philosopher, I'm kind of not. I work in a center for psychological humanities and ethics at Boston College, and what that means is I work with a lot of practicing psychotherapists, trying to get the discipline of psychology to broaden its scope a bit, to have more conversations with the humanities. So, philosophy, theology, literature. Now, so I'm not really I don't work as an academic philosopher, even though I would say that about myself. A lot of my writing is trying to weave philosophical ideas into kind of existential and psychological questions. And then I teach a lot of courses. I teach courses, continuing education courses for practicing psychotherapists on some of the thinkers and writers that I love. For me, the writers who I've always gravitated towards have been the ones who have been able to take kind of complicated ideas and show me why they matter to my life.
Mm.
And part of what led me to philosophy in the first place was that, as I kind of alluded to earlier, I was having this really terrible crisis of character in my life where I was asking myself, is what I'm doing meaningful? Is the life I'm living meaningful? Why have I gotten on the path that I'm on, both in my career aspirations, but also just personally? I had found myself not really. I went to Holy Cross in Worcester as an undergraduate, which is a great school. I had a great opportunity for education, but I was spending a lot of time just drinking with my buddies and skipping classes and kind of messing around and squandering that. And so I felt like the thinkers who first drew me to philosophy and to literature really were the ones who they showed me why the ideas behind their work really mattered in a personal way to me, really could speak to the crisis that I was facing. And so I think since that's what drew me to the intellectual life in the first place, my kind of goal has always been to show, whether it's students in my classroom or readers through my writing, that these ideas that often seem kind of heady and abstract actually really matter in concrete ways to how we live our lives.
Mm-hmm. I read one of your articles that I really loved on Psychology Today about resisting the me culture to have greater fulfillment in life. And I was thinking of whether you could speak about that, Matthew, of how that pertains to kind of work culture, because I think that feels like a paradox of like thinking less of ourselves might lead to greater fulfillment. And so I'm just curious how you might think about that in connection to what we do for work.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when you read any of the great works that have offered wisdom over the course of human history, and when you read enough of them, you notice kind of commonalities. A lot of thinkers and literary figures tap into similar ideas. And one of the common ideas that I find across various intellectual schools and even between Eastern and Western philosophy is this notion that the more we focus on ourselves, the more unfulfilled we feel. And the more we spend our lives giving ourselves away, and whether that means giving ourselves away to our artistic creation, the things that we invest our time and energy in, or particularly to other people, the more we actually realize who we're kind of meant to be in some sense, depending on what thinker you're dealing with. And the more we kind of realize that there is fulfillment in emptying ourselves, which is a very paradoxical idea. I think this has become like particularly true in my life. I was just having a conversation the other day with a friend about how just straight out I am. I have 4 kids. I have a dog. I have
right there. That's
I basically work 2 jobs at once, and then I do a lot of coaching. My kids are of the age where they're starting to play sports, and so I'm constantly, and my wife too. We always talk about we've done too much. We've overcommitted ourselves again. We're constantly running from thing to thing, and at times it can be overwhelming even. And yet, I am also often feeling like my life is very full. To give an even more concrete example of this, actually, I said I've always wanted to be a writer. in my early 20s, after I graduated college, I had time to write. I actually had like a lot of time to write, and I wrote almost nothing.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is when I was working at a deli in my hometown. I had time, but I squandered a lot of it because I had the time. And then once I got married and my wife and I started having kids and I started to embark on an academic career, I had less and less time. And yet my writing kind of started to take off. I started to not just produce more, but also to feel like the quality was enriched and that I was capable of doing deeper, more meaningful work on things that were kind of coming out of the wellspring of the fact that I was giving a lot of myself away in all these areas. And all of a sudden there was something kind of generative about that. And I would say that has certainly been an experience that I've noticed again and again in my life. And it's one that tracks with a lot of the thinkers who I read and teach.
Matthew, do you think of your journey as some sort of calling or a vocation to you?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. I would say that in some ways, my life has been a continued discernment of my vocation that's ongoing.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like in my life, I've been in a number of different positions, a lot of which I would not have chosen for myself. For a while, even recently, I had been saying, I'm not sure I want to do this work in this center that I'm working in. I really just want to write. I'm a writer. I got to find a way to get out of the academy even and just focus on my writing because that's where my call is. And yet I found myself in situations where all of a sudden I've woken up and I've said, oh, actually, I think I'm in the right spot for right now and where I'm meant to be. And now all of a sudden I'm seeing, like in the position I'm in, I've been surprised, like absolutely floored to find, no, this is really meaningful and significant work to me. So much so that if someone said to me, you could leave it and just write, I would say, no, I think I'm doing the work that I should be doing and that I'm meant to be doing. And my career has changed and I've gone through so many different, down so many different avenues over the last 15 years. I feel like at every point along the way, I've been doing what I was supposed to be doing then. So when I was really teaching a lot of undergraduate classes, at one point I was teaching 6 classes a semester at 4 different universities.
Oh my gosh.
That was not my ideal situation.
Right.
But I still have from various classes at different schools, former students who have become almost friends, who I keep in touch with, and who I got to be in their life at a point that was really important for them. And they have become part of my life in ways that are really significant for me.
Yeah.
And so I kind of feel like I'm constantly still discerning what my vocation is, but I'm in the right place or I'm moving in the right way.
Yeah. I love that openness you have to a sense of call and that it's an ongoing process and one that's responsive to the life you're leading right now.
One of the interesting things we've discussed about the notion of calling on our show is that calling can be dynamic and responsive. And sometimes we need the help of others to see what we might be missing.
In college, Matthew was still grieving the loss of his aunt and feeling aimless in his trajectory.
And I was kind of wayward. And so I was looking for something to change my life. I didn't know what it was. So I started going every night I went to Holy Cross, which is a Catholic institution, and I would go to daily mass at night at 10 o'clock, basically because if I went and sat there, I knew there would be almost no one there, like 3 people. So I could be left alone. And it would mean I wouldn't start drinking until 10:30, which was like 2 hours later than I was typically drinking with the guys, whatever. So this is kind of the place that I'm in. I meet this guy, my buddy Will, around that time. And I find that he too has similar questions to me. This is someone who I can talk to about death and how to think about it. I can talk to about what it means to live a meaningful life. We just hit it off and we're having these questions. And so all of a sudden, him and I would go to mass together, or on a night where I was like, I can't go out drinking again. I got to not do this. I'd go to his room and would hang out and would have these kind of philosophical, intellectual conversations. And it was a forming of a really important friendship. So then as I start to build this friendship with him, I find out that he also loves to write and has aspirations to be a writer. And so we start doing some writing together, and we're kind of really working collaboratively on a bunch of stuff.
After graduation, Matthew went on to grad school and Will went on to earn a law degree and ultimately landed a mergers and acquisitions job at an elite law firm in Boston. Though the salary and partner track looked enviable, Will found the 90-hour work weeks soul-crushing. During rare check-ins, Matthew kept nudging him to keep reading and writing, recommending works like Camus' Myth of Sisyphus to probe life's purpose.
Sensing an opening when his own mentor floated the idea of a new philosophy center, Matthew made a bold move.
I just got this instinct, this kind of urge, and I call him up, and he answered, which he almost never did at that point. I almost never connected with him, but he did answer. And I said to him, hey, this is kind of a long shot, and it might sound like a stupid idea, but I really think you should quit the law firm and get your PhD in philosophy. I said, I think that there's a path here with this center that might be on the horizon and stuff. There might be something in it. You should think about it. Now, my expectation would be that this would be one of many conversations and I'd be kind of prodding him and maybe it would go nowhere. But like 2 days later, he calls me up and he says, I'm going to quit the firm next week. I was like, whoa. So he did. He quit. Actually, he put in his notice without being in the PhD program. And now I should also say, Will and I were both English majors as undergraduates, so not philosophers. And neither one of us, not like we had 4.0 GPAs or anything like that. Like my own path to the PhD was very difficult. And the program that we ended up in is really, it's an exceptional program here at BC. So I didn't expect to get in myself, but then getting both of us in seemed like a complete impossibility. But he quit on a whim, not on a whim. I mean, he was ready to quit. He just needed the kind of push. And he ended up unbelievably with no other plan, with no alternative, without even applying to another PhD program. This was the only one he applied to, getting into the program. And now he's defending his dissertation in the fall.
Wow.
He has a wife and 2 kids. He says all the time that he would not have the family he had if he had stayed in that career, because he was dating at the time the woman who he married, but he barely saw her. He was, really straight out and really overwhelmed with the amount of work and unhappy with it. And so, he'll often say to me, you cost me a very lucrative career.
That's right.
And give me a hard time over that. But often also say that, without this change, he wouldn't have his kids. He wouldn't have his family. And it seems like hopefully I'm still doing that thing that I did back then and saying, hey, I think that there's some potential here. Maybe there's a pathway. So it seems like hopefully when he finishes his PhD, there'll even be a less lucrative, but a career path for him in the academy. So, and we've just, our friendship has rekindled in ways. Obviously, we have so much more in common than ever before and have become much closer than ever before. So,
yeah.
I love that reflection process that, even though you may have kind of nagged and pushed him, you were also kind of reflecting back to him what brought him joy, right? Like you were reminding him of those moments.
There's a way to kind of, to use your word, to mirror to people or to show people kind of the things that you see in them that you don't always articulate. And I think with Will, I just have always seen that he's an exceptional thinker, an exceptional writer, and someone who could do a lot more with his life than just grinding away over contracts in an office at 3-4 in the morning by himself, And so thank God by a shoestring, it's kind of worked out miraculously.
Matthew held up a vision for Will of a life of meaning, impact, and not just money.
And I loved his sense of ongoing discernment, right? And I find so much resonance in that. And I think that that's such an important work for all of us to be doing that ongoing discernment of where's meaning in my life? How am I living my life with purpose? And how that's going to evolve and shift. It's so rarely this steady thing where we decide at 22 what we're going to do and then stick with it. That it requires that ongoing work. I know what I was thinking about is connecting suffering to work. One of the things you and I have talked about is how suffering is part of work, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And a lot of times that we see how as soon as people in a work atmosphere hit suffering, it could feel like a sign to quit or like I made the wrong choice in this career path. And that there can be real value in working through some of that, setbacks, heartache, the painful rub of work not being exactly what we want it to be all the time.
Yeah. I love that story that Matthew tells about urging his friend over the years, right? Because it wasn't just sort of like a moment. It was consistent nagging, pushing, nudging. But his friend Will was clearly miserable in his work and thought he had to kind of plow through it because I think a lot of us think there's so many sunk costs.
Yes.
Right? Like, but I just went to law school. I just went to graduate school. I'm supposed to be on this trajectory. And again, it's that moment of thinking about, is it okay to release myself from this roadmap?
Yeah.
I do think there is something really interesting in what we hear in people's stories when they feel like they have to adhere to the roadmap, right? And they're trying really hard sometimes. Yeah. And then at one point, they just kind of take an off ramp and then they realize, oh.
It's liberation, right? Yeah. And I think when you're on that certain kind of confining career path, you're thinking about the immediate rewards, right? Like I've already invested all this money and time into law school. I'm being rewarded with a great job title and financially I'm being rewarded. And yet what Matthew said about his friend Will is he would have never had the marriage he has now. He would have never had the kids he had. That the rewards shift, with that ability to take a risk and to live a life that has greater meaning. Michelle, I keep thinking about how Matthew reframes suffering, not as something to avoid or overcome, but as a teacher. There's such wisdom in that, especially for work. So often we hit difficulty in our careers and we take it as a sign we're on the wrong path.
And what's striking is how he learned this from watching his aunt die. That experience was nothing like what he expected. It was painful and laboring and excruciating. But instead of turning away from that reality, he let it teach him something about how to live. And now he actively walks into spaces where suffering is present, like the prison education work.
Exactly. And there's something about that willingness to be present to pain that seems to open up this whole other way of being in the world. Matthew talks about how it creates this sense of responsibility. When you're not avoiding suffering, you start to recognize it in others and feel called to show up for them.
And then there's that beautiful paradox he describes about self-emptying. Here's someone who's constantly overcommitted, running from thing to thing with 4 kids and multiple jobs. And yet he describes feeling more fulfilled and productive than when he had all the time in the world.
It's so counterintuitive. When he was working at the deli with plenty of time to write, he barely wrote anything. But once his life became full of other people's needs, his family, his students, suddenly his work became more meaningful and generative. It's like giving himself away unlocks something in him.
That really challenges how we think about meaningful work. We often assume we need to protect our time and energy, create boundaries, focus on ourselves first. But Matthew's experience suggests that meaning might actually emerge from the opposite, from letting ourselves be poured out in service of others, even when it feels overwhelming.
And maybe that connects back to this suffering piece. When you stop treating discomfort as the enemy, when you're not constantly trying to optimize your way out of difficulty, it frees up so much energy to actually engage with what matters. The hard stuff stops being something that derails you and becomes part of the path itself.
Make sure you listen to Matthew's contribution to this shit pile. In it, he shares an incredibly moving story of loss as a young father and husband. It's a beautiful story you will not want to miss.
This has been another episode of A Life Worth Working.
She's Dana Allen Walsh.
And she's Michelle Weiss.
Don't forget to subscribe and share with your loved ones and friends who may also be searching for meaning and purpose in their work lives, or what we call the soul of work.